Hello, this is James Cook of the University of Maine at Augusta, and I'm recording this video to discuss social problems and a deep division on the question of what harm is, how we understand harm, and how that relates to social problems. If the existence of a social problem is defined by a sense of harm, then there are really two theoretical camps making claims about harm. On the one hand are objectivists. And for objectivists who study social problems, they say harm lies in empirically observable damage done to a society. And then the task is to try to figure out how to measure that harm, how to quantify that harm, and how to then ameliorate that harm. On the other hand, within the sociological study of social problems are constructionists. And constructionists are named constructionists because they believe in an idea of social construction, that in a series of groups by individuals and constituencies that are involved in discussion, there is a subjective sense of what is dangerous or damaging, what is harmful that is generated. And so, in that subjective sense, harm comes to be defined, and thereby social problems come to be defined. And therefore, if you're a constructionist, what's really important to understand is what individual people define as problems, what groups define as problems, and how those different definitions come to be, how they come to be communicated, and how certain definitions or ideas of harm come to prevail as the apparent consensus about what harm exists. That might have something to do with empirically observable damage done, but it also might have a completely different result than what empirical observations might suggest. This sets up a kind of a contest. And so I asked students, tell me what you believe the most pressing social problem is facing us today. And in a relatively small class, I had differences and yet some consensus. So there were some individuals, single individuals, who said, well, vaccination and the debate about vaccination is a pressing social problem. Women's rights in a time of political contention is a social problem. The question of marijuana legalization was mentioned. But then there was just one individual who mentioned each of those. Then there were two individuals who said something about the way that children interact with one another. One said the words that they use with one another. Another said, well, let's call this bullying. The bullying of some children by other children is a problem. Those were defined using different language, but they might be related to each other. And then finally, substance abuse. Two individuals used the phrase substance abuse, and a third individual referenced opioid abuse as most pressing social problem. So that is what's going on with individuals in the social problems class that I happen to be teaching. A different question is asked not of one small social problems class, but more broadly to the United States population. And this is an NBC News Wall Street Journal poll conducted at the end of April and the beginning of May in 2019. 900 individuals, representative sample generated of the United States population, with a margin of error calculated by the statisticians who work for NBC and the Wall Street Journal as plus or minus 3.3 percentage points. And what you see in the vertical axis here is the percentage of people who say that this is the one or two of the top items that should be the top priority for the federal government. Nearly 1 out of 4 say healthcare is the major issue that needs to be addressed. And then immigration and the border, then comes jobs in the economy, then comes national security or terrorism, then comes climate change, the national security, climate change, and government deficit spending are each at about 11%. And then down at 5%, guns, and 1% trade. Now, what's really interesting to me is that there is very little overlap between this result and what's going on in my class. There are two differences here. One is that we have a nationally representative sample versus an unrepresentative small group of individuals who are mostly geographically located in the same place in Maine. The second is a set of numbers. This is a small set of individuals. This is a large set of individuals. But a third difference that's really important to note is that the questioner says, let me list some issues that have been proposed for the federal government to address. So this is two kinds of cues. First of all, it's about the federal government and things that the federal government should do to address a problem, not whether a problem exists. And second, it's created by the pollster. So the person who's being polled has to choose between these options or might name their own. But these ones are the ones that are being suggested. Whereas here I asked an open question. I said, what do you think the most pressing social problem is? And I didn't say it had to be solved by government, because not all social problems necessarily do. But you'll notice here that we have two different kinds of answers, okay? And that there is no one answer, even in this poll, that gets a majority response saying this is the top issue. We could take either of these sets of ideas, right? And we might contrast them then with some empirical measures of harm done. If you think about empirical measures of harm done, we could ask, what's the worst thing that could happen, right? Well, one of the worst things that could happen is that a person could die. Okay, so if we think about the actual leading causes of death, the top is heart disease, followed by cancer, and then unintentional injuries. We're talking about accidents, chronic respiratory disease, stroke, cerebrovascular diseases of the head, then Alzheimer's disease, diabetes, influenza and pneumonia, kidney disease, and suicide. Okay, this is coming from CDC reports. If we compare this list of what is actually killing people, none of these are listed except under healthcare as a general category. National security and terrorism is listed as 11%, guns is listed as 5%, but guns, except for down in suicide, don't even come into the picture of how people actually die. And of those who die of suicide, okay, if these are rates of death per 100,000 population, by the way, that's what these numbers represent. Suicide represents an outcome in which, in the most recent year for which data is available, 2016, there were 44,965 instances of suicide, 22,938 of which occurred through the use of firearms, or what we might call guns here. That is nowhere mentioned among students taking the social problems class in this term, and yet it is the 10th leading cause of death. Neither are heart diseases described as a pressing social problem, or cancer. Accidents are not discussed. Stroke is not discussed. Alzheimer's disease is not discussed. Why? Why is dementia not thought of as a top issue for the government to address when it is one of the top causes of death? When we take a look at another source for causes of death that goes beyond the top 10, the National Vital Statistics reports of 2018 being the most recent, we might start to think about the issue of vaccination. What are the most pressing social problems regarding vaccination in the United States that are being discussed? Currently, it's having to do with pertussis and measles vaccination and rates of a lack of vaccination. And yet, if we take a look at actual causes of death in 2016, the last year for which death reports in the United States are available, pertussis deaths, whooping cough, is down at 11, and measles deaths are down at 0. Meanwhile, in terms of infectious diseases, influenza deaths are at 2,905, which is a pretty typical year. 2,905 individuals died of the flu in 2016, the last year for which data is available. The vaccine controversy, though, is not typically regarding flu vaccines, but regarding requirements for measles, mumps, rubella, and pertussis for children. And the number of deaths from those diseases is very low in the United States. So we have yet another mismatch. On top of that, if we think about infectious diseases more broadly, the number of deaths by another infectious disease, HIV, totals at 6,160 per year, which tops influenza as an infectious disease death causing infection. So if HIV is still killing 6,200 individuals a year, 3 times the influenza rate, and far, far higher than the whooping cough and measles rate, you would think we'd be talking about rates of HIV infection, and yet we're not. We're not talking about HIV as a national problem in polls. We're not talking about it in this class as an issue. What about drugs? There is a really pressing recognition of substance abuse as a problem, and related marijuana legalization as a problem. How does that lead to deaths? According to the National Vital Statistics report, well, 67,265 deaths are induced by drugs, according to that National Vital Statistics report in 2016. So that's a lot more, that's 10 times as many people as die from HIV infection, far higher than those who die by flu. So that is, the drug-induced deaths are reflected in this emphasis within our own social problems class by students, not really even in the picture of what is offered by pollsters for people to choose between here, unless we think of healthcare as somehow having to do with substance abuse treatment or dealing with drugs. But it's not mentioned by name. And yet it is a cause of death for 67,265 individuals. If you believe that's a significant cause of death, then you certainly would want to take care of that. However, those dying from cancer are almost 10 times as much, at 600,000 every year. And those who are suffering from cerebrovascular diseases, strokes, 142,000 per year, which is above 67,000 per year. And those who are suffering from heart attacks, diseases of the heart, is almost exactly 10 times as much, 635,260 per year. Also above the level caused by drugs, if we think that the epidemic of substance abuse is hurting people through death, then certainly we should also be concerned about diabetes, which is killing 80,000 per year. Yet it is not being singled out by name among students. The issue of diabetes, why is the issue of diabetes not being discussed? Finally, if we're not thinking about healthcare, but about simply causes of death that threaten us on an everyday basis, we might think about motor vehicle accidents. The number of people who were killed total up at 40,327 in the year 2016, according to these national vital statistics reports. That's not present here in the list of issues for the federal government to address, even though the federal government does have under its power transportation policy. Nowhere mentioned here in the most pressing social problems named in class. And yet vaccination is perceived to be an issue. Substance abuse and legalization of a substance are mentioned as social problems. So there seems to be a mismatch between our perceptions of pressing issues and death. We could also think about harm in terms of where we spend. The Bureau of Economic Analysis in the United States government, at the link that I'm showing here, talks about where we actually spend money. And while we spend a little bit of money on cars, and we spend a little bit of money on food services, both buying groceries to eat and then also going out to eat, the two big expenditures, the top two lines you see here on this chart, come from housing and utilities and healthcare. The two are almost equal. So in terms of where we put our money every year and the money that is being tossed out of our wallets and into the world in order to accomplish something, would indicate the two areas where our financial concern lies. One is in healthcare. The other is in housing and utilities, that sense of shelter, being able to have a place. And certainly, health causes are the main cause of death. Unintentional injuries that's not coming from healthcare, although we might have some healthcare after the fact. Suicide, if we end up killing ourselves, healthcare doesn't come into the picture. But otherwise, healthcare really matters here for death, so that lines up. It lines up with top government priorities. It doesn't match with the social problems class. That's a small number of individuals, unless we consider substance abuse issues to be a health issue. But what's missing for everybody here is the thing that we're spending a lot of money on year in and year out. This spending here, which is in the first quarter of 2019, surpasses that for healthcare, housing, and utilities. It's this thing we do. It's this thing that is draining our personal resources. This is consumer spending. And yet we end up not thinking about that as a social issue, not thinking about that as a social problem, and not discussing that as a social problem. All these mismatches depending on the kind of variable we look at, between these objectively measured um, uh, expenses or the ways we end up dying as individuals versus the articulation of issues that need to be discussed, um, is an indication that the objectivists and the constructionists are not always talking about the same thing. And this is why social constructionists say it's really important for us to think about the conversation we're having about harm and to distinguish between that and the objective harms that end up either taking our lives or taking our dollars.